huge pointy beaks, very short, stubby feet, and they catch fish. But we have them all around the US actually, where there's no water. They're obviously killing geckos and lizards, I guess. So it's the same thing. How can you have an obviously fishing bird that lives where there's no water? And same with the upland goose and so on. So all these things that clearly look like they must come from somewhere else, but they have changed to live in a new environment. So then, in this notebook, Darwin draws this diagram. It is very, very famous. This is Darwin's first tree of life. And this little sketch has been reproduced countless thousands of times. I get email requests about this every week from publishers and documentary makers. It's on mugs, it's on t-shirts, it's on hats, it's on bumper stickers, it's on book covers, it's all over. It's on tattoos, actually. Google it. You see lots of people that have tattooed this on themselves because it's quite famous. It's sort of the classic Darwin image. So, it's a tree of life. But let me explain to you what this actually means, or how it actually works. So, in his lovely handwriting, I've actually given you the text here so you can see what it says. But this is how it works. He just doodles this to himself. But this is the beginnings of his theory. And his theory isn't just about natural selection, which I haven't mentioned yet. This is really the core. Descent. Genealogical descent. So he imagine this is, number one, is the ancestor, is an early species. Pick whatever you want, the macrocemia or some finch or whatever, it doesn't matter. It's a hypothetical drawing, it doesn't represent any specific family. And then it might have a line of descendants, and perhaps some group branched off and became another species, here, right here. And perhaps another group branched off and formed another species. And then at this point, it branched into 3 more species. And maybe one of those branches branched into several more and so forth. Now the diagram also shows Darwin's understanding, because he's a geologist, he's a paleontologist. Lots of extinction. These lines, like this, that just dead end, are extinct. So he imagines that lots of these species form and then they die out and leave nothing, whereas some do not, they leave descendants. So at the present time, Darwin imagines, those with this little line at the end of them, these are living species now in the world, okay? And so now you can start to understand what he means in the text here. In other words, if you were looking at a bunch of birds, say minor birds, or Galapagos finches, it doesn't matter, right? You might say that, okay, well, these 2 species, B and C, are pretty similar. They look a lot alike. And D is, it's not as similar as those 2, but it's kind of the same. But these 2 are really similar, and that's a bit more different. And then A is quite different. But you'd say they're all finches, or all minor birds, or whatever. This is Darwin's explanation. The reason that there are things that are differentially related, some very similarly, some more distantly, is from common descent. They are commonly descended from the same ancestor, but sometimes more closely related through the passage of time. So he says that in his text. He says, thus, between A and B, so A and B, immense gap of relation. It means B and A are really different, but C and B are the finest gradation. B and C are very similar. B and D rather greater distinction. Thus, genera would be formed, bearing relation to ancient types. In other words, he's trying to relate how the fossil record of extinct things can be related to living things through a genealogical tree of normal biological reproduction from parent to offspring, suggesting that nothing has happened in the past that is any different. Wondering about how species came and went and so forth. Nothing happened that's any different than what is happening right now. Sound familiar? I hope hope you're thinking, oh, that sounds just like Lyell and his geological theory. Remember, he also said that in the distant past of the Earth, nothing really different happened than what's happening right now. It's just been so slow and gradual. Same kinds of causes have always been around. Darwin finds a very similar solution for the history of life. Okay, then he opens another notebook. Notebook C. He starts studying heredity, how it is that characteristics are passed on from parent offspring. You have to, I need to remind you that this is generations before genes or DNA have even been thought of by anybody. This is early days, but at least he appreciates that things acquire properties or whatever from their parents. He looks into the distribution of local and wide-ranging species. Some species are all over the world and some are only found in local places. Why should that be? And the distinction between systematic affinity and analogy. This is some Victorian terminology that's a bit confusing. Affinity means, ultimately, after Darwin, the word means similarity due to common descent. So if you've got two species of bird, like in that diagram we just looked at, that look very similar, one reason they might look so similar is that they are commonly descent from the same ancestor, not that far back. But there's also analogy, in which you can have two things that look similar for other reasons. That is not because they're closely related, right? Due to adaptations to similar environments. Now we call this divergence. I'll give you a basic example. A fish and a dolphin. Right? A dolphin and fish are not closely related, right? Dolphins are fish, they're mammals, but they're sleek and have fins and swim in the water, like a fish, right? So that sleek, streamlined shape and the fins sticking out of their bodies are very similar between fish and dolphins, but it's not from recent common descent. The dolphins and the fish acquired those features independently of each other. So in Darwin's terms, that would be an analogy, not due to affinity. Okay, then he goes and looks at the torturous question that was endlessly debated for centuries, the relation between habit, what we would call behavior, and the structure of an organism. Does behavioral change precede structural change? Remember the theory of Lamarck. Which way does it go for Lamarck? Remember the giraffe? Stretching its neck to reach the leaves, right? That's behavior preceding structure. The giraffe yearning, seeking, stretching to get the leaves. The behavior comes first, and the structure, the long neck, comes second. Darwin is not sure about this. What is the relationship between adaptation and heredity, between evolutionary change and evolutionary continuity? Big questions. Then finally, in Notebook D, we start to get, after all these, some of these interim theories, some of them dropped, some of them retained. Now, in 1838, just to remind you now, we started off way back in 1837. Now we're here, late 1838, we get Darwinism that we now recognize. The final version of the theory is almost here. This is a famous event that is often recounted. Usually, most of what I've just described to you will just be skipped, and you will just land on this. So, he reads a book by this man called Thomas Malthus, another reverend. They're all reverend. There are so many of these authors are reverends. Like Reverend Thomas Malthus was a sort of early economist or political economist or theorist. And his book was very famous because he argued for his theory of population growth. His book was very controversial because he basically argued that you should not feed the poor because they'll just breed and have more kids. And that means, not that he was cruel, he was a really nice man, but this will just mean more suffering. If you've got a starving family, and you put them on welfare and you feed them, they can just have a load more. And then in 20 years, instead of this starving group of people, we'll have a whole house full of starving people. That's even more suffering than we have now. So he thought it would be, in the long run, bad to help the poor in this way, because they will just reproduce and there will be more suffering. So it was actually, how do you say, cruelness to be kind. Yeah. So Malthus's book goes on and on about how population growth goes, and he was arguing against a couple of French philosophers who had a very flowery view about how everything is just getting better, science and exploration, the human world is just getting better and better. Progress is inevitable and it will last forever. He thought this was a flowery, unrealistic view of the world, and he used his theory of population to argue that it can't be true. In fact, the world is very dark and very tough because population growth is geometrical. In other words, two people, say they have 4 kids, and those 4 children, each of them is married and has 4, and so on. In a very short order of time, you will have a mushrooming population, unless it is somehow checked. And he compared this with what he called the rate of increase at which food production could increase. He said that can only increase arithmetically, as opposed to exponentially. You can add another field at a farm, and then another field and another field. That's 1, 2, 3, not 2, 4, 6. So that meant that population growth, we are doomed. Population growth is bound to outstrip food production. So human beings are bound for a future of struggle and so forth. The only cure is to keep population growth down through some more humane means. And I think I ought to tell you what that is. Because according to Malthus, it's moral restraint. In other words, abstinence. Because birth control in those days was considered pure evil. And, well, it was just not talked about in polite society, and was just wrong. Because people would be doing naughty things, trying to escape the natural consequences. No. He said poor people should just stop doing it. They should observe moral restraint and not have sex and not make babies, and then everything won't be so bad, because we don't want to have lots of starving people and so forth in the future. That was Malthus's book. That was his theory. So he was very well known for this. He was dead by the time Darwin is reading this. Okay, so endlessly historians like to say that Darwin's theory is thus based on economics. It's unbelievable how popular this view is. And I think it's complete nonsense. Darwin, if you actually read Malthus's book, as I have, it is astonishing how much this book is about different kinds of animals as well as humans. He gives endless examples of rapid population growth when circumstances are right and when there are no checks to population growth. Darwin, the naturalist, is clearly reading it for this. He doesn't give a toss about economics or the political views of Malthus. And after all, it's so trendy these days to say that readers make their own meaning out of the books they read. Fair enough, they do. And Darwin's meaning is he's just getting the biology out, which is what interests Darwin. He doesn't care about politics. He doesn't talk about it. It doesn't interest him. So I would say there's no economic influence here. It's not about the copying of Victorian social competitive values onto biology, which is such a popular view. No, Darwin is just looking at the biology in this book. Population growth. He transfers this idea to the natural world. Of course, the same thing must be happening throughout the natural world. Any organism you pick, even something as slow breeding as elephants, take my word for it, they breed very slowly. They reproduce it a slow rate. But if you left elephants to it, and none of them ever died or got killed or eaten, in a few thousand years, the entire surface of the earth should be wall-to-wall elephants. I'm not joking. That should happen by the geometrical ratio of increase. And that's true of every other species, of a frog, of an orchid, or whatever. The rate of reproduction is so great that that should happen. That would happen. But it doesn't. Clearly, lots and lots of things are getting killed off. They're being eaten by others. They're dying from disease or famine or accident or whatever. So this potential for explosive growth is constantly there. Things are constantly growing out and increasing, and they're constantly being mowed down by death and destruction and predators and all sorts of limitations. So the checks are constantly there despite this growing impetus or reproductive potential. And this is the key to Darwin's theory, to Darwin's breakthrough. There must be, he thinks, there must be something about the few that make it. It must be true, mathematically, that most are dying and few make it through to reproduce in the natural world. This must be true from the numbers. Few are making it. Why those? Is it just random? He thinks not. He thinks it's not just random which elephants or orchids or frogs happen to make it through the gauntlet of death to reproduce and pass on their characteristics, and which don't. And so he writes this funny phrase or analogy in his notebook. He says, the warring of species. So he sees nature as basically at war, that things are trying to reproduce and they're being cut down as fast as they reproduce. And so that, in fact, you have what appears to be a balance, because populations tend to be basically pretty even, but they're not even because they're breeding to a certain point and stopping. They're even because they're breeding at this huge rate and being mowed down at almost exactly the same rate. So Darwin sees this as the war of nature. That's his way of thinking. Nature is a war. So the warring of species, he says, as inference from the Malthusian law of population, one may say, this is a weird analogy, but think about it. One may say there is a force like 100,000 wedges. Do you know what a wedge is? A wedge is, those little blocks of wood that you put under a door to keep it from closing. That's a wedge. Metal ones are used to split wood. And that's the kind Darwin is thinking about. I don't suppose many of you have ever chopped wood before, but if you want to break large pieces of wood, you use a steel wedge, which you put on the block and you hit it with the back of an axe or with a sledgehammer. And the wedge to the wood and will split really big pieces, which if you hit it with an axe, will just stick. So to break big pieces, you use a wedge. So that's what Darwin is thinking about here. So he says, one may say there is a force in nature like 100,000 wedges trying to force into every kind of adapted structure in the gaps of the economy of nature, or rather forming gaps by thrusting out weaker ones. I wish somebody would do a computer animation of this, and if any of you can do this, please come and talk to me, because it would be amazing. So you just have to picture this in your minds. Darwin is imagining a surface. I imagine one made of wood, because wedges work well with wood. Anyway, 100,000 wedges are stacked all over this surface, and are all being driven with sledgehammers, all trying to force their way in. This is his analogy with what I was just talking about before, about the reproductive potential being mowed down by the warring of nature. In other words, the few that make it through, despite this constant pressure, all are keeping sort of balanced and checked. Not because they're just hanging out, but because they're all being forced in at the same time. But if any gaps ever appeared in the natural world, something would find its way in, something new would arise in that gap. That's Darwin's way of thinking. Do you see how it works? So, people then conclude that from this kind of thinking, now, what will become his idea of natural selection, that almost all of the offspring be it the seeds of a plant or pollen grains or whatever, almost all of them are being destroyed and dying and not reproducing. The few that make it, he later uses the phrase natural selection. It is as if they were naturally selected. And he uses that, he uses an analogy with farmers and breeders. Let me finish with that thought first. So Darwin later compares the way that farmers and breeders make breeds of animals or strains of crops by selecting which ones they will breed from, which ones they will use for breeding, and the others are excluded. And by selectively choosing, say, the chicken with the reddest comb on its head, or the cow that's fattest, by selecting these features, these attributes from an organism, again and again, generation to generation, farmers and breeders have made all kinds of amazing breeds by a long series of selecting which ones lived to reproduce. And Darwin thought that this analogy was not just an analogy, that it was the identical process in nature. That the few that naturally happen to have the attributes that allow them to make it through the gauntlet of death, through the war of nature, are the ones that are as if naturally selected. They make it through because of their own characteristics, they pass those on, and it's the same kind of process as farmers and breeders, selecting which ones will survive and pass it on. Okay, so he moves on to his last notebook, and there we see finally Darwin's theory of evolution as we would now recognize it in its final form. He says in one place, 3 principles will account for all. So here, if you like short bullet points for Darwin's theory, here's a good one from the man himself, those first 3 points. Grandchildren like grandfathers. In other words, offspring closely resemble their ancestors. Heredity, which we would now, of course, we have an entire world of genetics to fill in the gap that Darwin is just glimpsing with this realization about heredity. It is a fact. There is, things are hereditarily passed on. Number 2, there is a tendency to small change. In other words, all living things that are born are all a little bit different, especially with sex, where the offspring vary or are more different. Right? All of you are the result of sexual reproduction. You're all different from your parents and your siblings. You're all unique. And this is true for all sexually reproducing organisms on Earth. They're all a little bit different. And this is fuel for his theory that these little differences are what make the difference between which ones live, sometimes make the difference between which ones live and which ones die. 3, great fertility in proportion to support of parents. That's the whole thing about Malthus and the population explosion that I was talking about just a minute ago. Yes, so what I was just stressing about small variations, small changes. There is a contest, he says, and a grain of sand turns the balance. In other words, in this war of nature, the slightest change, the slightest thing about an organism might make the difference between it living and being able to reproduce, or snuffing it, getting killed off. It could be the slightest thing. Let me give you an example. Remember I told you that when human beings first went to the Galapagos Islands, the birds were so tame they would just land on your head. It is true. And they're, to this day, famously really tame. They don't really land on your head anymore, but they'll just land right next to you and you can walk up to them and look at them. And they don't fly away like most animals do. Why were they so tame? Do you know why? Can you imagine why? I'll give you an example. From my garden in Cambridge, every spring there will be generations of new starlings. It's kind of blackbird, it looks like a Mayan bird. Generations of the year's hatchlings, so these are sort of young little teenage birds, all fresh and feeling like toughies and running around the garden. They're quite aggressive, nasty birds anyway. So they're walking around in gangs, because they had not yet mated pairs, and they walk around in these little gangs, picking up insects in the lawn and so forth. And my cat would, of course, be concealed in the bushes, hoping to get one. I saw this many times. So the gang is walking along on the lawn, picking up their seeds or whatever it is they eat. And suddenly, my cat gets ready. You know how they do, they build up and shoots out of the bushes. And before the cat's whisker has even got past the first leaf, what happens? The birds, they fly off, right? I mean, birds' reactions are very fast. Why? Because if they weren't, well, this is the amazing thing. Every year, I would almost always see this, that the flock of birds would just instantly fly off. But there'd always be one or two that would go, huh? And wouldn't fly off. They would pause to look and, oh, what's that? And then guess what? Cat got them, and big fangs sank into their flesh, and they were devoured alive. That's the war of nature. Right there in my back garden, happening every year. My cat is a predator, and the birds all vary. And the ones that were not naturally super shy and super afraid and super alert, they are constantly being killed every day. This is the real world. Birds that are not shy, that do not fly off, get killed. But every year, of course, lots more are born, which vary a lot, and there's always a couple that vary in that way, unfortunately, and they get killed. This keeps birds shy and wary. But in the Galapagos and many other isolated islands in the world, there were no land predators. So birds that were pecking around and eating, and I don't know, a stick fell from a tree, or the wind blew, or a tortoise walked by, or something, if they went, whoa, flew off, they wasted energy, they wasted feeding time. Whereas if there was a shy one or two that just sort of went, they would be fine. No consequence there. So if you add that up over thousands and millions of years, that little bit of advantage to being tame, to not being wary, actually pays off in a place like the Galapagos. So after millions of years in isolation, when human beings got there, the birds had no fear at all, because that actually made sense for animals in that environment. And they've been paying the price ever since. When Darwin was there, he saw a little boy sitting next to a well where there was water, and the birds would come in the evening to try and get a drink. And the little boy just sat there with a stick. The bird would land, whack, kill it. Next bird would land, whack, whack. Until he had a big pile of dead birds which he took home to his mother for supper. That's pretty easy. For most places in the world, you have to sort of chase them or shoot them or trap them, or they're wary. But in the Galapagos, they have gradually become more wary, but I guess it takes a long time to outdo millions of years of tameness. Anyway, so imagine the example again of my garden in Cambridge, right? New outcrop of birds every year. There's always variation. There are always some things that are suitable and some that maybe aren't so suitable. And in that particular context, my cat was natural selection. And some birds were selected for lunch. Okay, so that they means by, in that thing, there's a contest and a grain of sand turns the balance. Or when, I'll show you later some amazing David Attenborough documentary clips, where a cheetah is chasing down some gazelles, and they're just running and turning, and the cheetah's just millimeters away from getting the gazelle, but maybe the gazelle just happens to get away. Sometimes it's that close. But this process of testing, of filtering, is constant. It's always happening. And it's not just things, it's easiest to give you examples of predator and prey, but there are also things like disease resistance and so forth. Okay, so adaptation is relative. And the let's get some of these. The source is variation or complex. He doesn't know why things vary the way they do. They just are born all a little bit different. Okay? But he's sure that adaptation is contingent and that the potential pool of variability is large. In other words, things can vary, offspring can appear in all sorts of different ways, which is why breeders, which we will use extensively for his examples, can make the most crazy different breeds of plants and animals. So for example, a sheep appeared once, I think it was in Scotland, which had really, really short legs, stubby. Okay, I don't know if his name was Stubby, but it was a really stubby sheep. His legs were so short, but otherwise it was identical sheep. And the farmer realized, wow, Stubby is great, can't jump over the fences. So he made, eventually, by always selecting Stubby's offspring, the ones with the short legs and never the long ones, always breeding from the short ones, eventually made a breed of sheep with short, stubby legs that couldn't jump over fences. And how did the farmer do that? He did not make short legs. He could only select from what naturally occurred. And that sometimes randomly you have various differences, sometimes more pronounced, like in this case, with a sheep with really short legs. Yes, so hence you see there, domesticated races are made by precisely same means as species. And we'll be talking about this a lot more in this course. So selection operates so that organisms are adapted to local circumstances, hence species may remain stable over long periods. So Darwin has a different answer to Paley and other people. Why do organisms fit their environments so well? His answer from now on will be from natural selection, from natural varying and from the natural world, as it were. Remember, it's always an analogy. Nature isn't actually consciously selecting, but as it were, being selected. And gradually, by infinite tiny incremental steps, very like Lyle, organisms come to fit their environment or their way of life ever more, ever closer way. So he writes, it is curious that geology, by giving proper ideas of these subjects, should be absolutely necessary to arrive at right conclusion about species. In other words, he thinks to himself, it's lucky that I was a geologist, or I never would have come to be able to think of biology in the way that I do. I would never have come up with this. So he closes this notebook, but it's not a finished theory. It's full of questions, it's open-ended. He's just starting now. Remember, I went into great length about the pile of beagle stuff he had. That's his day job. I say that as a kind of joke. I mean, he doesn't have a job, he's rich, but that he is working on the beagle things as his primary occupation. And the species theorizing he's doing in the background as a hobby of a hobby. But someday he will work it all out and finish this massive research program that he has in mind. So that's by 1839. I hope that you will recognize that Darwin does not publish his famous book, The Origin of Species, until 1859. 20 years after where we are right now. So, please have a look at the readings. They're super short. I need to clarify that when I say on the syllabus readings, those are required. If it says additional or supplementary, it's just a suggestion for you. You are not required to know those. That's why they're called additional or supplementary. Okay, that's it for this week. If you have any questions, I'm here to answer them.